A lab scraped a fleck of white paint off a 1914 masterpiece and found a pigment from the wrong century. That fleck ended a 35-year run of paintings that had fooled the best art experts alive. Because the man who made them wasn't copying masterpieces. He was inventing ones that had never existed. His name is Wolfgang Beltracchi, and his inventions hung in museums, auction catalogs, and very rich people's living rooms. Here's what still unsettles the art world. Nobody caught him by looking at the paintings. A normal forger copies. He picks a famous canvas and tries to match every brushstroke on it. That's a losing game. The real one hangs in a museum, and someone eventually puts them side by side. Beltracchi went the other way. He painted the pictures the artists never got around to making. It's the difference between forging a signature and inventing a cousin nobody in the family can disprove. And art history, it turns out, has an enormous number of relatives it can't account for. 2 world wars burned through Europe's studios and warehouses. Whole collections went into storage and never came out. Scholars keep careful lists of those lost works. A title, a date, sometimes one blurry black and white photograph. Beltracchi read those lists the way you'd read a takeout menu, looking for something he felt like making. He'd pick a gap. A Max Ernst destroyed in the war, a Campendonk last recorded in the 1920s. Then he'd paint it. Not a copy of it, the thing itself, for the first time. He worked in the styles of Max Ernst, Heinrich Campendonk, Fernand Léger, André Derain, Max Pechstein. And he was good. Not good for a forger good. Good enough that specialists called his paintings major rediscoveries. But talent was the easy part. The paint had to be as old as the story. So he bought worthless old paintings at flea markets, chosen only for the year the canvas was woven. He scraped them down to bare cloth, then painted his invention on a surface that had genuinely aged. Old stretchers. Old nails. Old frames. Pigments ground by hand, using only colors sold in the right decade. He'd bake a canvas in the oven to crack the surface the way 70 dry years does. Then work dust from a vacuum cleaner into the cracks, because clean cracks look wrong under a lamp. Now here's the thing most people get wrong about forgery. None of that's what sells a painting. Nobody spends millions because a canvas looks old. They spend it because of the paper trail behind it. Where has this thing been for 100 years? Whose wall? Which gallery? Which sale? That trail is called provenance, and it's the part of the art world nobody photographs. It's a stack of documents, receipts, and old photographs. And Beltracchi understood something about documents. Everyone checks whether a story is consistent. Almost nobody checks whether the story was manufactured. So he built a collection that had never existed, and gave it a real man's name. His wife Helene had a grandfather, Werner Jägers, a Cologne businessman who was entirely, verifiably real. Real records. Real address, real death. Everything a careful researcher would look up and tick off. The invention was one sentence, that Jägers had quietly bought modern paintings before the war. One plausible sentence, attached to a real man, and suddenly, the paintings had somewhere to have been. But a sentence isn't proof, and here's where it stops being clever, and starts being extraordinary. They needed evidence the collection existed. Old evidence. The kind you can hold in your hand. So Helene put on a 1920s dress, sat in an old chair, and posed as her own grandmother. Behind her on the wall hung the paintings. The ones her husband had finished that same year. They shot it with a pre-war camera, on photographic paper old enough to match the claimed date. They aged the prints, and just like that, the collection that never existed had a family photo. Think about what that photograph does to an expert. It doesn't argue with you, it just sits there. A grainy woman in a grainy room, and the painting is simply on the wall behind her. You don't interrogate wallpaper. Your eye goes to the picture, and your gut files the room as fact. They backed it up with dealer's labels on the reverse, from a famous Berlin gallery of the period. Alfred Fleckheim was real, and handled exactly these artists, so the back of the canvas confirmed the front. And here's where it flips from a story about painting, into a story about people. The experts weren't lazy. They did the job the way the job is normally done. They studied the brushwork, compared it to known works, read the provenance, and found it all consistent. Which it was. Every piece of it had been made by one man to be consistent. One of the world's leading Max Ernst scholars examined several and endorsed them without hesitation. People who had known Ernst personally looked at those forest paintings and saw an old friend's hand. That's the real lesson in this case, and it reaches a long way past art auctions. Expertise checks whether the evidence fits together. It rarely checks whether the evidence was built to fit. If that just reframes something for you, that's exactly what this channel is for. Stick around. Because for years the market rewarded him for it, and the numbers got serious. His paintings moved through respected auction houses and major dealers on both sides of the Atlantic. Single canvases sold for millions. 1. Max Ernst, he invented resold for several times its first price. Prosecutors eventually valued just 14 of his paintings at more than 16 million euros. 14. He suggested the real number runs into the hundreds, across dozens of artists, over 35 years. And he wasn't hiding in a basement. They lived openly, traveled, bought a house in France. For decades, the only thing that could catch him was the one thing he controlled completely: his materials. Every pigment ground by hand and checked against what was actually sold that year. He was fanatical about it. Zinc white for the early works because titanium white came later. That distinction is the entire case, so hold on to it for a minute. Titanium dioxide is the white in your toothpaste, your sunscreen, and the paint on your ceiling. It's brilliant, cheap, and everywhere now. It wasn't available to painters before the First World War. So a 1914 canvas containing titanium white isn't a suspicious painting, it's an impossible one. Beltracchi knew that better than anyone, which is what makes the next part almost unbearable. In 2006, a Campendonk of his, Red Picture with Horses, went to auction in Cologne. It sold for about 2.9 million euros. A record for the artist, and his biggest single sale. The buyer was a company that did what almost nobody in that market bothers to do. They sent it to a laboratory, not out of suspicion, just because that was their process. The results came back showing titanium white in a picture that was dated 1914. He hadn't ground that white himself. He'd used a ready-made tube of zinc white from a trusted supplier. The label said, zinc white. The tube also held titanium dioxide and he never tested it. 35 years of grinding his own pigments, undone by the one container he took at its word. And once a single painting fails, the whole structure starts pulling itself apart. Investigators traced the provenance, and found the Jaeger's collection existed in no records but his own. The Flecktime labels turned out to be fabrications. Then someone looked hard at that old photograph. The woman in the 1920s chair wasn't her grandmother, it was Helene in costume, decades later. In 2011 the trial opened in Cologne, and Beltracchi did the last thing anyone expected. He confessed. Calmly, in detail, and with obvious pride in the paintings themselves. He got 6 years. Helene got 4. He served much of his in an open prison, working days outside. Then he was released. He paints under his own name now, sells legally, gives interviews about the method. Meanwhile, the damage behind him can't really be measured, because most of it was never found. The scholar who authenticated several Ernsts was sued and ordered to pay, in a case that dragged on. Collectors discovered that the most valuable object they owned was worth roughly the price of its frame. And somewhere out there, paintings he made are still hanging with the wrong name beside them. Museums won't say which. Owners don't want to know. A test can only ever lower the price. That's the quiet part of this case, and it's the part worth taking with you. The analysis that caught him costs a few €100 and needs a fleck of paint the size of a crumb. It existed the whole time. It just wasn't run, because nobody in the room wanted a bad answer. So here's the useful part. When something valuable arrives wrapped in a beautiful story, ask who made the story. Documents, photographs, references and labels are the cheapest things on earth to manufacture. Physical facts aren't. Verify the thing that can't be rewritten first. The material. The date. The pigment underneath. Beltracchi didn't beat the experts. He beat a process that read the paperwork and trusted the paint. 35 years, hundreds of paintings, and nobody in the chain wanted to be the one asking for a lab report. If you want the mechanics of how these deceptions actually work, not just that they happened, subscribe. Next time, the con man who sold the Eiffel Tower for scrap metal, and then did it again. Cases like this deserve to be remembered accurately, not just retold. Thanks for staying to the end.